thank you for the invitation, and thanks to everybody who organised this event and for the authors and translators of this wonderful book. So the potential for reformational life and thought in our turbulent century is a typical reformational title. It's like everything. Say something about everything. I can't do that, but I'll try to say something about something and see if that lands. So during the day we have done various things. We've celebrated the book, we've reviewed thereby some of the achievements and distinctive accomplishments of reformational philosophy and thought. We've notionally briefly mentioned some of its limits and some of its failures, perhaps not enough. But what about its potential for the future? In turbulent times, a time of multiple crises that I do not need to rehearse to this audience, where we are confronted constantly with what are called wicked problems, problems that seem to defy resolution or even understanding. It is the case, isn't it, that new intellectual and cultural movements are often birthed out of crises, times just like ours, as was Reformational philosophy, of course. But I want to suggest that there are at least three distinctive gifts, or charisms, anointings, let's say, if we want to be sacramental about it, that the Reformational movement still has to offer in the face of the crises of our times. And spoiler alert, I don't have anything really very new to say, but I hope that by reminding us of some of those charisms, at least we may be packed off into the November darkness with a little glimmer of hope. That's perhaps my low expectations. Perhaps yours are higher. And those three charisms are simply these, that we have a constructive way of reading the signs of the times, that we have an inspiring vision of the interconnectedness of all things, and thirdly, that we have hopeful resources for practical wisdom. So those three main sections. And then if there's time, I want to say briefly a word about the Reformational movement and the churches, who typically get left out of most discussions of Reformational philosophy. So first of all, a constructive way of reading the signs of the times, or discerning the spirits of the age, to use a different phrase. Now, of course, Reformational thought is not the only movement that does this. Lots of other Christian thinkers and non-Christian thinkers and movements have tried to do so at times of cultural crisis, to get beneath the surface of the presenting crises of the time and work out what, at a deeper level, is going on. Many modernity critics have been doing this for many decades, indeed centuries. What is, if anything, the special emphasis of a Reformational way of reading the signs of the times? Well, as you'll all be familiar, the movement specializes in offering what it calls depth-level diagnoses of the fundamental forces and conflicts of whatever is its contemporary society. So Herman Dooyeweerd wrote in the 1940s a widely read book with the title Roots of Western Culture. Many of you will have read that. It's probably his most readable book, most accessible book. And that's because it was written as a series of journalistic pieces in the late 1940s addressed to the Netherlands that was at the time wrestling with a future after European economic collapse, fascism, and war. And if you know that book, you'll know that the central organizing structure of that book is that Dooyeweerd applies what he calls ground motive analysis to a reading of post-war Europe in the 1940s, in particular the Netherlands. Later on in the 1970s, S.U. Zuiderma wrote a book called Communication and Confrontation, which did the same sort of thing. In the 1980s, Bob Goudsvaart wrote a book, Idols of Our Time. Many of you will know that. Edward Herman, who's already been mentioned, Technology in the Future, and much more recently, Lambert Zijderbaard's work on the architectonic critique of society has continued in the same vein. So this is something that the movement is used to producing, these what they think of as depth-level understandings and diagnoses of our times. Of course, this was already anticipated by Kuyper. For example, those of you who know lectures on Calvinism will know that he paints in large brushstrokes. There is paganism, there is Catholicism, there is modernism, and then, of course, the solution is Calvinism. Bob Gatzvard, in Capitalism Progress, perhaps more deftly distinguishes between what he calls three depth levels. That's society. Those are the problems that we confront on a daily basis, problems of government, problems of economic crisis, and so forth. Below that is the level of culture, which kind of orchestrates and pulls together those surface manifestations that show up at the institutional level. But below all of that, of course, or permeating all of that, is religion. And the signature of this movement is to trace these pathologies back to their deepest religious level, which for Bob Gatzvard in that book was faith in progress, still very much alive. Doesn't know when to call it a day, almost a century later. And of course, we're not alone in doing so. The movement known as radical orthodoxy, emerging out of British, oddly, Platonic / postmodern theology, has produced a very powerful and an arresting diagnosis of contemporary society that works at the same sort of level. Often very powerfully. I've got my critiques of it, like many of us in this room will have, if you know about it, but nonetheless engaged in the same enterprise. John Paul II, in Centesimus Annus, for example, developed the same sort of depth level analysis. So we are collaborators. We should see ourselves as collaborators here, and contributors to a larger Christian enterprise of seeking to discern the spirits of our age and how they manifest themselves in these many different ways. But let me just say one other thing about the distinctive flavour of Reformational diagnoses, and that is that they are expressed against the background of a robust and comprehensive view of creation, more so, I think, than other comparable movements. Creation that is seen as having the power to reveal its orderings and its wisdoms even to fallen humans. That is, that creation is articulate. Creation speaks. It reveals itself to us. And we need to pay attention to it. And when we pay attention to it, then we find ourselves walking in ways of blessing and flourishing, insofar as we understand those ways, which is never easy. And so the emphasis is that the current pathologies at any time that we experience derive from creatures misconstruing their radical dependence on the Creator, and thus inevitably misconstruing those created orderings and the place of humankind within them. So the spiritual disorientations underlying our crises are then misconstruals of one or other of God's good gifts in creation, perhaps by lending them inordinate power, idolatries, showing up in the world of theorizing as what Dooyeweerd called absolutizations and reductionisms, his particular language. But the key here is that there is always some profound insight into the good that is lurking within such distortions, something which we have not yet fully grasped, which is why dialogue and encounter are always possible and indeed mandated. It seems to me that this reveals a long-standing Augustinian idea of evil as not real in itself, but as a privation of the good, a falling away from goodness. It's a deprivation. It's not a substantialization of what is evil. Because the only good things in creation, the only things that exist in creation, are those that are gifts of God. So our Christian discerning of the spirits can never simply be attempts to expose evil or sin, but always to call people and ourselves to the good, because this is how they will flourish in God's world, and perhaps then seek and find God. So, as Gustavo Gutierrez famously put it, we are engaged not only in denunciation, but also in annunciation. And let me just give two very quick examples. In the economy, yes, we need to continue to offer and update our critique of the radical distortions of individualism, consumerism, oligarchy, technocracy, the financialization of the real economy, the new military technological complex driven, as Alan continues to teach us, by a semi-autonomous defense industry. That's mainstream Gaussvardian analysis just brought up to date. But we also need to point to and embody constructive humanizing alternatives that reflect the goodness of created orderings and potentials, that seek the simultaneous realization of norms. Not mere denunciations of capitalism, which are 10 a penny in the Theological Academy, but construing economic activity as a noble vocation with a vocation to contribute to the common good and to social justice. And there are other examples that we can follow. It's not simply those that have come out of the Reformed tradition. Obviously, in the more Catholic tradition, there's a school known as civil economy, which has influenced Pope Benedict and Pope Francis, which echoes many of the same themes that Reformational philosophy would want to echo. Or donut economics, propounded by Kate Raworth of Cambridge University, among others, which seeks a more integrated notion of economics. In politics, again, nothing new here. What we experience is rapidly growing economic instability, economic inequality, and insecurity, causing cultural dislocation, not only for indigenous communities, but also, in our countries, of the white working class, who now feel fundamentally alienated from our polities. The attendant ecological damage that these economic forces produce, and the resulting sense of political impotence. And these widespread experiences of cultural alienation and economic marginalization are, as we know, fueling exclusive and often religious nationalisms, authoritarian populisms, xenophobia, and racism. So that constitutional democracy is under imminent threat in many of our Western and indeed non-Western societies, in some ways returning us to the crises, the political crises of Dooyeweerd's time in the 1930s. The difference, of course, is that, and this is not encouraging, today economies are much less controllable by nation states, by their governments, than they were in the 30s. Not least because it's dominated excessively by transnational corporations, especially unaccountable tech giants. Civil society, or what the Dutch called the middenveld, is much weaker. Society is much more culturally and morally fragmented. And the rise of authoritarian populism in many countries has exposed how skin deep is many citizens' commitment to constitutional democracy. Shockingly so, including millions of Christians, not just in the US, easy to poke fun at them, in this country too, as large numbers of Christians get lured by the attraction of parties like Reform. So yes, that sort of denunciation needs to continue, but we also need to point to and embody and enact constructive alternatives. And here it seems to me there's a lot of work to do. Reformational philosophy has developed a very sophisticated theory of the state, but originally only a very rudimentary theory of democracy. That's certainly true of Dooyeweerd's work. And that's ironic, of course, because his work emerged out of Kuyper, who led one of the first mass political movements in Europe. What happened to that? It got lost along the way. Well, since then, of course, lots of great work has been done in the Netherlands by many people, including a wonderful book by Roel called Moral Capital, but there are many others as well coming out of the Netherlands. And in North America by people like James Skillen and David Koyzes, who you just heard earlier. Recommend his books very strongly. His most recent one on citizenship is an excellent start. So yes, lots of work has been done, but there's still a massive amount of work to do to articulate a compelling account of a just, participatory constitutional democracy. able to respond effectively to these crises and to the shifting sands of the pathologies of our new politics. So those are, I think, some of the elements of the distinctive way in which Reformational thought has gone about the task of discerning the spirits of our age. And this leads directly into the next two charisms. I see time is running against me, so see how we get on. And the second charism is an inspiring vision of the interconnectedness of all things. Some of you will know of, or hopefully have read, the wonderful encyclical by Pope Francis on the environment called Laudato Si. If you haven't read it, 2015, you can Google it right now on your phones. If you haven't read it, read it. It's a marvelous piece of work, and it's shot through, from a Catholic point of view, with this idea of interconnectedness. The interconnectedness of humans with each other and of humans with all dimensions of the non-human creation. And it seems to me that here Reformational movement, the Reformational thinking, has a distinctive gift to offer, equally in its own vernacular, so to speak. That is, that creation is not only ordered, which is not a very interesting thing to say, actually, if you end the sentence there. Not only ordered to the human good, which is a more interesting thing to say, and a very important thing to say, but also creation is revelatory of God's sheer delight in differentiation, complexity, interdependence, dynamism, mutual service. This is shot through the creation order by God's wisdom. And before this impacts philosophy, which I'll say something about, it should shape our whole way of being as creatures in the creation order. It should mould what Dooyeweerd called our naive experience. That's that pre-reflective encounter with the world that we experience constantly, all the time. You know, Dooyeweerd points out that our first encounter with the world is not theoretical, thankfully, but existential or quotidian, where we see things and people not abstractly or taken apart, analysed, but as wholes, as they present themselves to us as wholes. Well, now I think we need to extend that vision to the totality of creation. And here, the ecological crisis is our best teacher, is it not? That we have to learn to live as glorious, capable, embodied beings, human beings, but also fragile, dependent, interconnected creatures alongside all our fellow creatures whose identities and interrelations we must discern and respect. And here, of course, there are many openings to join with and learn from many others who are hearing creation grown just as we do, through their own lenses, but recognizing the brokenness of creation, the fact that we have failed to respect and honor the interconnectedness of all things to great consequence. For example, the wisdom of indigenous peoples around the world who are teaching us once again what it means to live with nature as part of nature and not over against nature as its masters and exploiters. You could say that what we need is a new spirituality of creatureliness that is nurtured in worship, prayer, liturgy, community, and that permeates all aspects of our lives, our churches, and beyond that, of society as well. And one of those elements, or one way of working towards that is, as Craig has hinted already, a better conversation between Reformational philosophy and theology. I'll come back to the church later. Actually, I won't, because I'm running out of time very rapidly. But you did say 30 minutes. I'm only coming up to 20. So a new spirituality of creatureliness, don't you think that has a bit of a better ring than, a better appreciation of naive experience? Somehow that seems to connect better with more people. But let me turn to philosophy briefly. What's the implication of this recognition of interconnectedness for philosophy? Well, the book that we're celebrating tells you all about that, so I don't need to say very much about it. But these notions of interconnectedness underlie the whole of Dooyeweerd's highly specialized philosophical framework. And note that he emphasizes, and we need to emphasize, both the distinctness of different things, we're very good at that, but also the interrelationship of different things. And we're not necessarily, historically, always as good at that. So modal diversity, yes, but also modal coherence, intermodal coherence. Structural diversity, yes, sphere sovereignty, but also interstructural relationships and interlacements and all those complex networks that Dooyeweerd uses the term encaptic for, maybe not the best term, ways in which there are these mutual dependencies and interconnections between all sorts of different entities, including social institutions. The human body as a complex network of encaptic interlacements, for example. Such ideas all need further refinement and have had it in the work of some people in this very room. And that's great. We need to continue that work of refinement and correction and deepening. And these have proved to be powerful analytic and diagnostic tools in making sense of many features of created reality, seen in many disciplinary and interdisciplinary fields. Just a word about the university sector here, which is charged with leading this intellectual project, as we see it. So, on the one hand, the university sector has vastly expanded in scale and cultural power since Dooyeweerd wrote. At the same time, it has descended into increasing fragmentation, directionlessness, and increasing domination by utilitarian and commercial and bureaucratic imperatives. So now work is increasingly piecemeal, pragmatically oriented, short-term, confined by bureaucratic norms and targets, and subject to shifting political decisions on funding and things like academic freedom. Social transformation, which in Dooyeweerd's time many academics thought was a necessary part of the scholarly vocation, has now been reduced to impact assessments, tiny little piecemeal changes that can be measurable by some algorithm. And there is, as a result, partly of that, but partly due to other factors, a widespread distrust of the certain integrative theories of interconnectedness, in other words, across different fields and within different fields. Still less claims to truth. Now, of course, this is due significantly, in part, to the impact of deconstructionism that has affected many disciplines, perhaps less so the natural sciences. And while, on the one hand, in part, this was a valuable corrective against the hubris of rationalism, scientism, and colonialism, so that there is a case for decolonizing the curriculum, and don't let people simply dismiss you as involved in wokery for supporting measures like that. There was a correction necessary, and deconstruction has achieved part of that. Nonetheless, it has left generations of scholars hesitant or maybe incapable of speaking of truth, and reluctant to, or simply have no idea how to explore the interconnectedness between the specialized, increasingly tiny fields of knowledge that they are charged to work on. Yet at the same time, it's not all a story of dismay. There are many hopeful counter trends in the academy, as you would expect. If you subscribe to Dooyeweerd's vision of creation, creation is going to kick back at you if you misconstrue it. And you can suppress certain truths and certain areas of creation-based knowledge, they'll start seeping through in other ways. So there's all kinds of pushback against this reductionist view of the university. In ecology, for example, in radical economics, in theories of embodied knowing, in an increasing concern about the ethical implications of AI and so forth, and in many other areas too. Which means then that again, we're not simply engaged in denunciation, but also in annunciation, and we can work with and expect to work with, collaboratively, constructively, with other scholars from all different perspectives, to do what Andrew Basden has rightly called enhancing humanist scholarship, rather than simply negating it.
So let me now move to my third theme, hopeful resources for practical wisdom. I've tried to say already that Reformational philosophy's cultural critique is distinctive in that it's grounded in a rich account of the created orderings we confront as creatures. And so therefore, it's ultimately constructive. There's an awful lot of critique and diagnosis in Reformational philosophy, but the point of that is to construct a true and a better account of created reality to help us live, to give us wisdom to live. And just because that account that Reformational philosophy offers conveys a vision of deep and complex interconnectedness, it's capable of informing practitioners in many fields and has done so. So Reformational philosophy seeks to shed light on the fine grain of lived reality, and it works outwardly from that. And Dooyeweerd was always insistent that philosophy should be no speculative construction, nor was it the result of a deduction from abstract first principles. Rather, philosophy should engage in what I want to call perspectival induction. So it's perspectival, Dooyeweerd argued, and he wasn't the only one arguing that, and since then there have been many others who've argued that as well. It's perspectival in that human beings inevitably view reality through the perspective of some sort of philosophical framework or faith or worldview. But the point of philosophy is not to sort of dwell introspectively on that perspective. That's part of its work, but that's not its main task. That would be risking just disappearing into a kind of internal hall of mirrors, like the worst kind of speculative theology or philosophy. Rather, the purpose is to read reality through its lens. And reading reality is, you could say, a kind of induction. Put in biblical language, it's to engage in naming. So in Genesis 2, God presents animals to the humans in the creation account, presents animals to the humans to see what he would call them. And it says, whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. Now, that certainly suggests a human authority over other creatures, an authority to name non-human creatures. And that fits with that presentation in that passage of human beings as made in the image and likeness of God. But the implication is, and this is exemplified throughout the rest of Scripture, especially in the wisdom literature, such as Proverbs and so forth, that naming activity has to follow seeing, experiencing, encountering, discerning the distinct identity and nature of things, and thus deciding what is the right name for that creature. And not just their individual names, but their place within the created order as a whole, alongside all kinds of other creatures. So the purpose of naming is to pursue a God-given curiosity about things. What is this and how does it work? To exercise a responsibility for things. How do I care for this thing as it is, so that it is what it's meant to be, and so that it can serve other creatures in the way that it's meant to serve them within the larger framework of creation itself? And then how do I care for this thing and nurture it so that it becomes what it needs to become? And of course, on top of all that, just to enjoy a sheer delight in created things, both to give glory to God and to bless humans and other creatures. Now, it seems to me that what I'm calling perspectival induction is in fact what many practitioners do as a matter of course. They do it by default, intuitively, without necessarily being aware of what they're doing, nor may they be aware of the perspective that they bring to it. Even less will they be aware that that perspective may or may not be a distorting perspective. And all of us, of course, including Christians, like anyone else, are susceptible to bringing distorted perspectives to our naming activity of things. But when it's done more or less correctly and without distorting perspectives, what practitioners are doing, or all of us are doing in many respects in different spheres of activity, is asking, what is this thing that I'm engaging with? What's it for? How does it work? How does it relate to other things and other creatures? And how can it be repaired or improved or healed? And Reformational philosophy brings the lens of interconnectedness to bear on these very practical tasks. And here I just want to mention again, it's already been mentioned, what seems to me the distinctive and really outstanding work of the normative practices model that's been developed in recent years by a number of Reformational philosophers, mostly in the Netherlands. And these philosophers and practitioners working together, often hand in hand, have been very successful in showing what this means in areas such as medicine, psychiatry, international relations, education, military technology, development, communication, food production, animal welfare, and other areas too. And it seems to me that there's an open field here for those that are shaped by and drawing on Reformational philosophy to extend this kind of model into all kinds of other areas. I'd love to see it developed in the area of politics and citizenship, for example. I think it's an excellent case, in other words, of where Reformational philosophy needs to go in the future, even while maintaining a core interest in systematic philosophy and the investigation of the conceptual foundations of that kind of model.
The final thought, the Reformational movement in the churches. So, Neo-Calvinism and then Reformational philosophy were birthed by and borne along, crucially, by powerful, integrated, unified social movements and organizations that enabled it to do so. That's also true of Catholicism, by the way, in the same period. Very well organized organizational structures that bore these movements along. The ideas didn't just sort of propagate themselves, they were carried by bodies in organizations. Well, and crucially, of course, in the Netherlands, these were mobilized by the Reformed churches. Without the Reformed churches, these movements would not have got going. They'd have shriveled on the vine, they'd have disappeared, as so many others do. But today, of course, a century and a half later, all churches are in a vastly weaker position. I just don't think there's a single example of anything like the Gereformeerde Kerk that birthed Neo-Calvinism in the Netherlands in the 19th and 20th centuries. I don't know of a single, maybe in perhaps the new emerging Pentecostalisms in Brazil, but are they heading in the right direction? The jury's out on that, I think. So church is in a vastly weaker position, both numerically, as a result of secularization, catechetically, as a result of the collapse of ecclesial authority, the collapse of leadership in churches. And when was the last time you thought, I've got to change my life because my church thinks I should? Right? There's very little exercise of ecclesial authority now over members. And weaker socially as a result of decades, centuries of privatization. So as a result of the weakness of the churches, Christian social and intellectual movements are also much weaker, much smaller, more fragmented and dispersed. So, there is no longer a single mothership for Reformational philosophy. It was once the Free University, it's that no longer. So a vision of Reformational philosophy will then need to be carried forward by networks rather than by big institutions, for the foreseeable future at least. In which case we're going to need to be wise, nimble, humble, cooperative, and ecumenical in our work. That's the new strategy and tactics for the future of Reformational philosophy. And that's what's already happening here in the Netherlands and globally. That is the way forward. And we simply have to accept that, work with it, and make the very best of those opportunities that the global network presents itself to us. And finally, of course, to do that, we need to remain connected to supportive churches. Where are they? That's the point at which I'll stop and leave you to think about that. How can we, individually and through our networks, somehow remain connected to the nurturing faith communities, the liturgical communities, the worshipping communities, the teaching communities that we need? Right? We do not stand over against the churches primarily as their teacher. We need churches in order to nurture us so that we, in our small corner, as those attached to this particular tradition, can be teachers in our own sphere. Where do we find those churches and how do we contribute to them? Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, we've covered a lot today, and I'll try and be fairly brief. Just a couple of reflections, thinking about kind of where we are and maybe the idea of hope for the future. And I was thinking, one of the things we need to do is to look back, and I think that's one of the things that we've drawn on today. We've looked back at Dooyeweerd. There will be some people, I imagine, who might say, why look back to a 20th century philosopher writing in very arcane language? But we do look back and we get inspiration from that, and we've learnt a lot today about the value that Dooyeweerd has, and we've looked back further than that as well. We've looked back to Groven von Prinsterer, if I'm saying his name correctly, and I think these things are really important, looking back and seeing the roots and the sources and the richness of that, and not seeing Dooyeweerd on his own, not seeing Groven von Prinsterer on his own, not seeing Kuyper on their own, but seeing them as part of their tradition. I think some of what Jonathan said has been really helpful as well about we need to look outwards as well and beyond ourselves. We are a small tradition, and it's really helpful, I think, to see lots of good things kind of parallel to what's being done in the Reformational tradition in other traditions. And so I think that's something we need to do, as well as looking back, drawing on and learning from the tradition, also looking out and seeing the other traditions, Christian traditions especially, and how we can learn from them and perhaps work together. Maybe there's an element of that where we're looking around and feeling weak. I think the other thing that we've kind of touched on is this idea of looking forward and the idea of hope and so on. And I thought it's interesting that Jonathan talked a little bit there about our sense of weakness, and I think maybe there's a hopefulness as well in a sense of weakness, because surely as Christians it is in the weakness, in the death of the seed, where something can grow. So maybe we should look with some kind of hope that the strength of Reformational philosophy and Reformational movement might feel like it's weakening, but maybe in the weakness there is something good there that we can look around. And the last thing I wanted to connect it with is this sense of troubled times, and it made me think of the kind of sort of biblical imagery of a storm or a flood and that sort of idea. And what Jesus teaches us is that we listen to the words of Jesus, but we don't just listen to them. We have to put them into practice. We have to find our root in the rock. And I think that's what we do. When we look back, we see people like Dooyeweerd building on the rock that is Jesus' teaching. And when we look outwards as well, and we look at other Christian traditions, we can see that building on the rock. And then that's ultimately where our hope in our weakness should be, is on the rock. And one last final thought is, I like the idea that it's building on the rock. So it's the rock that is our foundation. But we are, again, this is a phrase I think that Dooyeweerd actually uses, is that we are put to work. Scripture puts us to work. So we build on a foundation, but that means we're doing something. We are building something, and that hopefully God will bless us in our weakness. I will finish there. Thank you.
Yes, I'm a food scientist, but recently I've been working with immunology, ironically because I have lots of allergies, but that's how you get here. So I would like to focus a lot on the reason why we're here is because of Jesus, because Yeshua HaMashiach. That's Jesus, the Messiah, and the importance of him, of who he is basically why we are all here. We're trying to discover his world, his creation. As a scientist, and then getting into Dooyeweerd, it's been an amazing way of trying to just as Arturo, this Mexican, yeah, I'm also from Mexico, like he said very well, thank you very much. It's a way of really getting our faith with what we do. And especially as a scientist, it's just so impressive to follow this track of how the world has been created and the little part that we can, play into this whole creation. And I think that one of the most important things of writing books is exactly this thing, that we manage to discover parts of the world and place them into books and pass it to other people, like me, for example, and reading now this structure, these tools that Dooyeweerd left in some of his books, and trying to make sense of the world from a Christian perspective, from acknowledging that the meaning of life is ultimately Jesus himself. And for me, that's been amazing. And one of the things that I was telling Martin and also Richard was that when I became a Christian, lots of people recommended me so many Christian books about apologetics, and I didn't like probably none of them, because it was this insistence on, like, you have to believe this because the Bible says so, and that disconnects a little bit with the experience that most of us not growing Christians have with the world. Well, when you start reading Dooyeweerd, and now this book that Martin and Gerrit and Susanne have put together, it explains you why you believe what you believe, and how to tackle life from a different perspective, and to explore other parts of the world that are amazing. So suddenly the world starts to be like more interesting and more intricate, and the way in solving life problems or like things in my career, for example, suddenly it starts to make a better sense of it, which I really enjoy a lot. And in a way, I'm kind of happy that I came all the way to the UK to discover this book, because it matched a bit with when I was studying my PhD. So that gave lots of momentum into the studying and reading books, and then meeting David and all these amazing people, Mark and Martin. Then this network of learning and discovering the world has been just impressive, like Craig as well, of course. And I don't want to leave anybody behind, because it's been such an experience. And I really think that this book, because I have recommended to my students in Mexico to read the Roots of Western Culture, and some of them came back to me with lots of frustration, because they said, this is difficult. I don't understand what it says. And I understand that, because I also struggle, even with the translation of Adolfo. Like it takes some time to try to understand what's going on in there. And but this book, what I was telling you, Martin, in the break, is that it feels slightly easier to go through. So this hobby, that is pretty much a hobby for me, like reading these kind of things, it becomes a lot softer, and I think it's more approachable. And I really hope in God that it reaches lots of people, because it's lots more approachable than this very strong philosophy that you have to kind of like make lots of effort to try to get into understanding what's going on. So with the translation, I'm really looking forward to it, and to recommend it to my students in Mexico and lots of other people, and to see this is not that difficult, and it is so full of lots of wisdom that we really need to make more open to the world. So yeah, thank you very much for that. And to Jesus as well for allowing us to do all this.
So You know, there's a beautiful thing in the patristics, the church fathers, about that end which is no end. And I think as we enter into Advent, something of that comes to my mind. And then I don't know about you, but I've had a number of times today the experience where I haven't wanted it to stop. So Richard, I really want to hear everything Jonathan had to say. You know, and I didn't want him to cut short. I mean, it was profound. I think, Jonathan, what I just loved about what you did, you're able to fully appropriate the gift of this tradition, but not compartmentalize it and open it into dialogue with the range of Christian thought. And so, Richard, if you guys in Leeds are able to do it, I think we need to have a session where we hear all that Jonathan was going to say to us today, and a time for Q&A and so on and so forth. Now, you know, people have to go to get to trains. The Dutch are getting tired because their clocks are a bit out, I imagine. I do want to, in conclusion, just to use Reformational philosophy to just do a very simple thing. And that is to say, as I understand Reformational philosophy, lived experience and not theory is primary. So the abstraction of theory can only ever develop out of lived experience. And in my opinion, what I would teach my students in Canada, the test of good theory is whether, when it returns to lived experience, it deepens that. And I think an endless danger of this kind of tradition in modernity is that it, like modernity, embraces the cerebral, forgets about the pre-theoretical, starts to despise the church, and in a mirror image of modernity, theory becomes the royal road to truth. Now, I don't think that's true of the Reformational tradition, but I think it is a danger of the Reformational tradition. And so I loved, Jonathan's emphasis on spirituality. You know, that's what I was asking Roll about, the reveil. We can do this theoretical analysis till the cows come home. But here is where I would invoke Kierkegaard. We may be the most sophisticated Reformational thinkers on the planet, and if we're unable to attend to the one thing necessary, then it is all in vain.